Hello everyone, this is Mr. Mitchell. Let's get started. Today we're going to be looking at positive slope. More specifically, we're going to be looking at if I were to give you an equation that has positive slope, would you be able to graph that on a coordinate plane? So let's start by doing a very quick review of slope-intercept form, because remember that most of what we're going to be doing this year, we're going to be using slope-intercept form. And if you remember, slope-intercept form is written as y equals mx plus b. With the equation y equals mx plus b, there are two different parts that we have to pay attention to. The first part is the b, and if you'll recall, the b represents the y-intercept. And remember that the y-intercept is where the line crosses the y-axis. The second part that we look at is the m value, and the m represents the slope of the line. Okay? And we talked before about how slope of a line is the change in y over the change in x. Another way of saying that same thing that most of you are probably going to like a little bit more is to think of it as the rise over the run. And there we go. Rise over run. Okay? And this is going to be a little bit clearer once we actually start graphing all of this. So now, let me give you an equation, and let's graph the equation and see what we come up with. So let's say that I gave you the equation y equals 2/3 x plus 2. Actually, let's change that. Let's make it plus 4. So we have y equals 2/3 x plus 4. Now when we graph things, it's usually easier if we start by graphing from the y-intercept. And the way that you can remember that is the y-intercept is represented by the variable b, which you can think of as the beginning of the graph. So let's look at our equation that we have here. We have y equals 2/3 x plus 4. And if we look at this plus 4 is the y-intercept. That's my b value. So on our graph, we are going to actually start by looking first at the y-axis, which is right here, and our y-intercept is positive 4. So on the y-axis, we are going to put our first point right here at the positive 4 on the y-axis. So we're just going to go ahead and put a point right there, and that's the first point of the line that we are about to graph. The second point comes from the slope, because whenever you have a line, you need to have 2 points. There's no way to graph a line from 1 point. Well, not this specific line anyway. You could graph as many lines as you want to. But if we wanted to graph the line that matches this equation, then we have to start from that point. And we have to look at the slope, which in this case is 2/3. So when we're talking about slope, okay, there are two different parts to it, the rise and the run. The rise is the movement up and down. Okay, think about when you rise up in the morning. You don't move sideways and just move out of bed sideways. You always stand up out of bed. You're rising out of bed. If you're sitting in a chair and you stand up, that's the rise. You're moving upward. Okay? The run is the sideways movement. When you guys run, you never run up walls. Your parents might say that you run up walls all the time or something like that, but it's not true. We all know that. People don't run up walls, they run sideways. Okay? So the rise is the movement up and down, and the run is the movement sideways. So on this particular slope, we have 2/3. The rise is 2, and the run is 3. So the way that we graph our line is we start from the point that we already have, the plus 4 on the y-axis, and our rise is 2, which means we're going to move up 2 spaces. The run is 3, which means I'm going to move 3 spaces to the right. Now, some people will say, well, why can't I move to the left? And that's a valid question, and it's actually a very simple answer also. If you look at the x-axis, okay, it's down here, going sideways across the graph, when you move to the right on the x-axis, you're always moving to the more positive side of the x-axis. Okay? When you move to the left, then you're moving toward the negative side. And since our slope is a positive 2 and a positive 3, then we have to move in a positive direction, meaning we have to move to the right. So in this case, when we graph this, we're going to move up 2 spaces for the positive 2, and then 3 spaces to the right for positive 3, and that's where our second point comes in. Now, when you guys graph these, please, please, please never only graph 2 points, because it's very easy for students to sometimes make mistakes on their counting or accidentally skip a square or maybe not get enough squares. So whenever you graph, please make sure that you count out the slope twice. Okay, so from that second point that we just got, I'm going to count it out again. I'm going to move up 2 spaces, and I'm going to move over to the right 3 spaces, just like I did before. Now, from here, it should be fairly obvious that we now have a perfectly straight line if I were to connect those 3 points. And when you guys are doing your work, if you notice that your points are not a perfectly straight line, then that means that you either counted wrong or you did something wrong with your slope. So that's another reason for making sure that you have at least 3 points, is that you can look at that and figure out whether or not you actually have a straight line. So that's how we graph using an equation using positive slope by starting with the y-intercept and then counting out the rise over the run. Before we go, I'm going to do one more problem for you just so you guys can get another example. So this time I'm going to change things up just a little bit. We're going to use, let's say, gray this time. What I want to do this time though is I want to show you what happens if we give you something like this. If I just gave you y equals 4x minus 3. Okay? First step, always the same. We always start with the negative 3 in this case. Now, when we look at negative 3, what you guys need to remember is that that negative 3 is still the y-intercept. So if I'm looking at my y-axis, I need to figure out where negative 3 is. And it's fairly obvious, it's right there. And that's where our first point goes, is at negative 3 on the y-axis. So there's my first point. Now the thing that looks a little bit different on this graph is on this graph we have this 4x right here. And our slope of 4, it looks like there's no run. It looks like it's just the rise. It's just the number, the numerator of our fraction. But what we need to remember is that everything can be written as a fraction. All we have to do, and you should know this from your elementary school days, is we turn that into a fraction by putting it over 1. Because remember, 4 is the same thing as 4 over 1. Now we have a slope. We have a rise of 4 and we have a run of 1. So let's go ahead and count that out. Starting from the first point that we had for this graph, which was at negative 3 on the y-axis, we are going to count up 4 spaces, and then we're going to move over 1 space, and that's going to be our second point for this graph. Okay, and then again, to make sure that we counted everything correctly, we're going to move up 4 spaces, and then we're going to move over 1 space, and there's our third point. And again, you would use a straight edge or a ruler, and you would draw the line for this graph, and mine's not going to look very good, but if I had used a ruler, then that would have been a perfectly straight line and everything would have matched up just right. So there you go. That is how you graph a equation with a positive slope. I'll see you guys tomorrow.